The final days of the Eastern Kingdom were stained with fire and fear. Dawn had not yet broken over the village of Brionne when the soldiers came. Their torches were like angry, malevolent stars, descending from the hills, painting the sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The air, usually filled with the scent of dukiest earth and baking bread, was now thick with smoke and the metallic temps of panic. Doors splintered under the force of iron-shod boots, and the screams of families ripped through the pre-dawn quiet. I was 17, an apprentice to the village healer Elara Vale. My hands, which were meant to mend and soothe, trembled as I hid in the cellar beneath our small cottage. With me was a little boy named Finn, no older than 6, his face buried in my tunic, his small body shaking uncontrollably. His parents had been among the first to be dragged from their home. I had pulled him from the street just moments before a soldier's gauntlet could seize him. I whispered promises of safety I wasn't sure I could keep, my own heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The floorboards above us groaned, and heavy footsteps echoed through the small space. A rough voice barked my name. They knew who I was. Healers, even apprentices, were valuable, either for our skills or for the knowledge we held. I held Finn tighter. "Stay quiet," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. But the heavy trapdoor to the cellar was ripped open, flooding our hiding spot with terrifying torchlight. A soldier, his face a grim mask of duty and indifference, sneered down at us. His eyes were cold, devoid of any pity. "There you are, little healer," he grunted, descending the ladder. I pushed Finn behind me, a futile gesture of protection. Another soldier followed, his sword drawn. There was no escape. They dragged me from the cellar, my fingers pried from Finn's small, desperate grip. His cries were the last sound I heard from my old life, a sound that would haunt me for years to come. Outside, the horror was absolute. My neighbors, my friends, the people I had grown up with, were being herded like cattle into the village square. Some fought back, their defiance met with swift, brutal force. Others wept silently, their faces etched with despair. Cold, heavy iron chains were clasped around my wrists. The metal was biting, a stark symbol of my new reality. I was no longer Elara Vale, the healer's apprentice. I was a prisoner. We were chained together, a long, shuffling line of despair. The soldiers, mounted on dark, imposing war horses, prodded us forward with the butts of their spears. We left our burning village behind, the rising sun illuminating the columns of smoke that now marked its grave. Our march was silent, save for the clinking of chains and the quiet sobs that no one had the strength to suppress. We were being led away from everything we had ever known, toward the jagged, foreboding peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Days blurred into a grueling, soul-crushing trek. The terrain grew harsher, the air colder. The lush farmlands of the kingdom gave way to rocky, unforgiving mountain passes. Food was scarce, a stale crust of bread, a sip of brackish water. Our captors spoke little, their expressions unreadable. They were merely instruments of a collapsing kingdom, their own humanity seemingly stripped away by the grim duty they performed. Whispers traveled down the line of prisoners, hushed and filled with dread. The word was passed from one captive to another, a venomous secret that chilled us more than the mountain wind. Arkanum. They were taking us to Arkanum. The name alone was a death sentence. It was a place spoken of only in terrifying tales told to frightened children. A fortress carved into the heart of a mountain, a prison from which no one, not a single soul, had ever been known to return. The stories claimed it was a labyrinth of darkness and stone, guarded by more than just men. Some said it was built over an ancient, malevolent power. Others whispered of monstrous creatures that roamed its lower levels. It was the kingdom's final, forgotten repository for those deemed enemies of the state. For the inconvenient, for the lost. It was a place where people were not just imprisoned, but erased from history. As we rounded a high mountain pass, we saw it for the first time. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like a wound in the world. A massive, gaping maw of black stone carved into the sheer face of the tallest mountain, a fortress that seemed to swallow the very light around it. Two colossal statues of hooded, sorrowful figures flanked the entrance, their stone faces eroded by centuries of wind and ice. They looked like sentinels guarding the gates to the underworld. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had settled over me. This was Arkanum, the end of the line. The soldiers shoved us toward the immense iron gates, which groaned open with a sound like a dying giant. Beyond them lay only darkness, a profound and absolute blackness that promised no escape, no hope. As I was pushed across the threshold, the chilling mountain air was replaced by a stale, cold draft that smelled of damp stone, decay, and something else. Something ancient and deeply wrong. The heavy gates boomed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the vast cavernous space, sealing our fate. The last sliver of daylight vanished. We were plunged into a world of shadow and stone. This was not just a prison. This was a tomb. And as my eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, a chilling realization settled in my bones. The stories had not even begun to describe the true horror of this place. The real nightmare was only just beginning. Arkanum, the prison of shadows. Imagine a fortress not built, but carved directly into the sheer face of a black, unforgiving cliff. The wind here doesn't just blow. It howls, a constant, mournful scream that sounds like the forgotten souls of ages past. This place is the very definition of despair, a monument to hopelessness etched into the stone. Inside Arkanum, the concept of a prison cell is almost a luxury. Prisoners aren't confined in neat rows of bars and doors. No, they're cast into what are known as circles. Picture deep underground stone pits dug into the bowels of the earth. The darkness in these circles is absolute, an almost physical presence that swallows light whole. Any flicker of hope, any memory of the sun, is devoured by the oppressive gloom. It's a place designed not just to hold the body, but to crush the soul. And overseeing this empire of shadows is the Warden, Lord Malrick. His reputation precedes him, a chilling whisper in the darkest corners of the kingdom. They say he has a talent, a cruel art form, for breaking even the strongest, most defiant spirits. He doesn't use brute force alone. His methods are far more insidious, psychological torment that erodes a person from the inside out until nothing is left but an empty shell. So when Elara, our beacon of light and rebellion, was dragged through the gates of Arkanum, Lord Malrick was there to greet her. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply looked at her, at the unwavering fire in her eyes, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was a smile that promised pain, that reveled in the challenge she presented. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper that coiled around her like a snake. "Light in the dark," he breathed, the words dripping with mockery. "Let's see how long you last." For Elara, this was the beginning of her true trial. Down in the circle, the darkness was a living thing. It seeped into her bones, cold and heavy. Days and nights blurred into one endless stretch of black. The only sounds were the distant, echoing drips of water, the scuttling of unseen creatures, and the low moans of other prisoners lost in their own private hells. At first, she held on to her memories of the sun, of green fields and the faces of her loved ones. She would close her eyes and try to summon their light, a desperate act of defiance against the suffocating void. But Malrick was patient. He wouldn't allow her even that small comfort. He would visit her circle, his silhouette a darker patch against the near-total blackness. He wouldn't bring a torch. He preferred the dark. His voice would slither down to her, speaking of failure, of abandonment. He told her that her rebellion was forgotten, that the world outside had moved on without her. He described in vivid detail how her friends had forsaken her cause, how her sacrifices meant nothing. Each word was a carefully chosen poison, designed to plant seeds of doubt and despair. "Your light is a flicker in an endless storm," he'd taunt. And every gust of wind, every drop of rain is mine to command. Soon, you won't even remember what the sun looks like. He manipulated her food, sometimes providing just enough to keep her alive, other times leaving her to starve for days. He played with sound, sometimes plunging the pit into absolute silence for so long that she began to doubt her own hearing, and other times bombarding it with disembodied whispers and screams that seemed to claw at the edges of her sanity. The other prisoners were a gallery of brokenness. Some had been there for years, their minds shattered, muttering to themselves in the dark. Others were fresh arrivals, still raging against their fate before the oppressive weight of Arkanum inevitably ground them down. Elara tried to speak to them, to forge a connection, but they were islands of misery, too lost in their own suffering to reach out. They were a living preview of her own potential future, a warning of what she could become. Yet, something in Elara refused to break. The more Malrick tried to extinguish her spirit, the more she clung to a tiny, stubborn ember within herself. She began to fight back in the only ways she could. She started to meditate, focusing not on the light she had lost, but on the darkness that surrounded her. She began to learn its textures, its sounds, its very essence. The darkness was Malrick's weapon, and she decided she would learn to wield it herself. She learned to distinguish the sound of a guard's footsteps from the skittering of a rat. She learned to use the echoes in the pit to map out its dimensions. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It became a landscape she could navigate. Her senses sharpened, adapting to the eternal night. She wasn't just surviving in the dark. She was becoming a part of it. Malrick noticed the change. Her defiance was no longer fiery and loud, but quiet, cold, and resilient. It infuriated him. He had broken kings and sorcerers, heroes and villains, but this one girl, this light in the dark, was adapting. His visits became more frequent, his psychological attacks more vicious. He brought down a former comrade of hers, a man now broken and loyal to Malrick, to speak to her of her failures. The man wept and begged her to give up, telling her there was no hope. Elara looked up, her eyes now accustomed to the gloom, and saw not a traitor, but another victim. "He can't break what's already forged in shadow," she said, her voice steady and clear, echoing in the pit. The words were not for the broken man, but for Malrick, who she knew was listening from the edge above. A silent war was being waged in the depths of Arkanum. It was a battle not of swords and shields, but of will against will, spirit against shadow. Lord Malrick thought he was extinguishing a light, but he was mistaken. He was merely forcing it to transform, to become something else entirely. He was tempering her in the darkest fires, unknowingly forging the very weapon that might one day be his undoing. The girl who entered Arkanum was a beacon of hope. The woman who might emerge would be something far more dangerous, a master of the shadows. The Warden wanted to see how long she would last. He was about to find out that she intended to last longer than him, and her story was just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you're captivated by Elara's journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this dark saga. See you in the next video. Elara's first night in the Obsidian Spire was a symphony of despair. The cold stones seeped into her bones, and the distant cries of other prisoners echoed like ghosts in the darkness. She had been warned to keep to herself, to become invisible. But invisibility wasn't an option when a figure emerged from the deepest shadows. A figure that made even the most hardened inmates shrink away. He was tall, with a wiry strength that his tattered uniform couldn't hide. But it was his face, or rather the lack of it, that captured everyone's attention. A mask of cold, dark iron was bolted around his head, covering every feature. Small, menacing slits were cut out for his eyes, but they revealed nothing but an impenetrable blackness. The mask was crude, heavy, a brutal piece of metal designed not just to hide, but to punish. Rust crept along the edges, staining the pale skin of his neck. This was Kai, the boy they called the Iron Ghost. Whispers followed him like a shroud. They said he'd been born in the spire, that he'd never seen the sun. Kay said he'd murdered a guard with his bare hands. Kay said he was more monster than man. Elara watched as he moved to a corner, the metal of his mask scraping against the stone wall as he sat. He moved with a coiled tension, like a predator waiting to strike. No one dared to get close. They gave him a wide berth, their fear a palpable force in the cramped cell. But Elara wasn't like the others. She had seen true monsters, men who wore smiles while they destroyed lives. This boy, hidden behind a prison of iron, felt different. Curiosity, a dangerous trait in a place like this, tugged at her. She needed to understand the story behind the mask. Ignoring the frantic, warning glances from other prisoners, Elara slowly approached him. She sat a respectful distance away, not wanting to crowd him, but close enough that she wouldn't have to shout. The air crackled with tension. She could feel every eye in the cell fixed on them, waiting for the explosion. Kai didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. For long, agonizing minutes, they sat in silence. The only sound the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Elara's heart pounded against her ribs. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the stories were true. She was about to retreat, to melt back into the shadows, when he finally spoke. His voice was a low growl, rough and distorted by the metal encasing his head. It was a sound that vibrated with raw, untamed power. "What do you want?" The question was a challenge, a dare. Elara swallowed hard, finding her voice. "I just ... I wanted to know your name." He was silent for a moment, and she could almost feel his gaze burning through the slits in the mask, dissecting her, judging her. "They call me the Iron Ghost," he rasped. "But that's what they call you," Elara replied softly. "It's not who you are." A strange sound came from behind the mask, a harsh, grating noise that might have been a laugh or a sob. He shifted, turning his head slightly towards her. Even this small movement was filled with a threatening energy. "You're new. You still have that spark of defiance. They'll beat it out of you, or burn it out." Elara shook her head. "No, they won't." Her voice was quiet, but firm. "My name is Elara." She extended a hand, a gesture of peace in a place that knew only violence. He didn't take it. He didn't even look at it. He just stared straight ahead into the oppressive darkness. "Names don't matter here," he said. The words laced with a bitterness so profound it made Elara's own sorrows feel small. "We are just numbers, waiting for our turn to be forgotten." Despite his words, despite the wall of hostility he projected, Elara didn't retreat. She saw the tremor in his hands, the rigid set of his shoulders. This wasn't just anger, it was pain. Deep, unyielding pain. She recognized it because she carried her own version of it. The fear the others had of him began to fade, replaced by a nascent, fragile empathy. Over the next few days, a strange ritual formed between them. Elara would sit near him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sharing the silence. She told him about her village, about the sun-drenched fields and the scent of wildflowers after the rain. She spoke of her family, of the warmth of her mother's embrace and the sound of her father's laughter. She painted pictures with her words, trying to bring a sliver of light into the perpetual gloom of the spire. At first, Kai remained a statue of iron and rage. He rarely responded, and when he did, it was with cynical, clipped remarks designed to push her away. "Hope is a fool's luxury," he once snarled, after she spoke of a future beyond the walls. But Elara was persistent. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was just trying to see him. One evening, as the meager rations were passed through the bars, a larger, brutish prisoner tried to snatch Elara's piece of stale bread. Before she could even react, A blur of motion exploded from the corner. Kai was on his feet, his body a whip of fury. He slammed the larger man against the wall with a force that seemed impossible. The cell fell silent, the air thick with the promise of violence. The sound that came from him was a low, guttural growl, more animal than human. He didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. The bully scrambled away, leaving the bread on the filthy floor. Kai picked it up, brushed it off with a surprising gentleness, and walked back to Elara. He placed the bread in her hand, his metallic fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting moment. Then he retreated to his corner without a word. That was the turning point. In that single act, he had confirmed what Elara had sensed all along. Beneath the iron, beneath the layers of rage and despair, there was something else. A flicker of a protector, a ghost of kindness. That night, she approached him again. "Thank you," she said softly. For the first time, he didn't try to push her away with his words. He just sat there, the silence between them different now, less hostile. It was then that he finally told her. His voice, still distorted by the mask, trembled. Not with fear, but with a fury so intense it seemed to make the very air vibrate. "They took my brother," he whispered, the words like shards of glass. "Leanne, he was younger. They said he was defective, unfit for labor." He fell silent, and Elara could feel the weight of his unspoken grief. The spire wasn't just a prison, was a culling ground. The weak, the sick, the defiant, they disappeared. Kai's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. "I fought back. I tried to stop them. That's when they put this on me, to make an example, to show everyone what happens when you defy the Warden." He touched the side of his mask, the gesture full of self-loathing. "They made me watch as they took Leanne away. I can still hear him calling my name." Elara's heart ached for him. She finally understood. His rage wasn't a random wild force. It had a target, it had a purpose. It was the only thing keeping his brother's memory alive. It was the fuel for a promise he had made to himself. He looked at her, and through the dark slits of the mask, she felt the full, burning intensity of his gaze. "I will burn this place to the ground," he vowed, his voice no longer a whisper, but a declaration of war. "I will find the Warden, and I will make him pay for what he did to my brother. For what he's done to all of us." In that moment, Elara saw him clearly. Not the iron ghost, the monster of the whispers. She saw Kai, a boy with a broken heart, wearing a mask of iron and carrying a fire that could either consume him or set them all free. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she would help him hold the torch. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss part 4 of Elara's journey. Whispers began to circulate through the frigid air of Arkanum, carried on the stale breath of desperate prisoners. They were faint at first, like the rustling of rats in the walls, but they grew louder with each passing day. A rebellion, they said. A secret uprising was brewing in the very bowels of the inescapable prison. Hope, a long-forgotten commodity, began to flicker in the eyes of the damned. The stories were wild, almost mythical. They spoke of a tunnel, a hidden passage burrowed deep beneath the lowest circle of the prison, a relic from a bygone era. It was said to have been dug by the very first captives of Arkanum, a testament to their unbreakable will, a legacy of defiance buried for centuries. The guards dismissed it as folklore, a madman's fantasy to cling to in the final. Agonizing moments before despair consumed them. But the prisoners, they believed. They had to. At the heart of these whispers, one name echoed louder than all the rest: Kai. He was the supposed leader, the architect of this nascent rebellion. Kai was a paradox, a man forged in violence and shadow. He had been in Arkanum longer than most could remember, a living legend whose past was a tapestry woven with threads of blood and betrayal. His reputation preceded him. Tales of his ruthlessness were campfire stories told to frighten new arrivals. He was a survivor, but at what cost? He had navigated the brutal politics of the prison, climbed the ladder of power on the rungs of broken bodies and shattered alliances. His hands were stained, not just with the blood of his enemies, but with the blood of those who had once called him a friend. Elara listened to these rumors with a heavy heart. She had seen Kai in action, witnessed the cold, calculating glint in his eyes as he made impossible choices. Trusting him felt like embracing a serpent. How could a man so steeped in darkness lead anyone to the light? He was the embodiment of everything Arkanum was designed to create: a predator, a survivor who thrived on the weakness of others. Yet, as she looked around at the gaunt faces, the broken spirits, and the ever-present shadow of the executioner's block, a chilling realization settled over her. She couldn't trust Kai, but she couldn't afford not to. The alternative was a slow, grinding decay, a descent into madness, or a swift end at the hands of the Warden. The Warden, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning, seemed to sense the shift in the prison's atmosphere. The patrols became more frequent, the punishments more severe. A single misplaced word, a hopeful glance, was met with brutal retribution. Fear was the Warden's favorite tool, and he wielded it with surgical precision. He wanted to crush this budding hope before it could blossom into a full-blown insurrection. He made an example of a few prisoners who were caught speaking of the tunnel, their screams echoing through the stone corridors for days. The message was clear: defiance would be met with unimaginable pain. The whispers quieted, but they didn't die. They were driven deeper underground, just like the fabled tunnel they spoke of. Elara knew she was at a crossroads. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her head down, to stay away from Kai and his dangerous games. She had survived this long by being invisible, a ghost in the system. But the whispers had planted a seed of possibility in her mind, a seed that was starting to sprout. She watched Kai from a distance, observing him. He moved with a quiet confidence, his eyes missing nothing. He wasn't rallying troops or giving grand speeches. His rebellion was one of secret handshakes, coded messages, and stolen moments in the shadows. He was playing a long game, a dangerous chess match against the Warden, and the prisoners were his pawns. One evening, as Elara was heading back to her cell, a small, grimy piece of parchment was pressed into her hand. She didn't see who gave it to her. They were just another shadow in the dim light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Getting caught with this would mean a one-way trip to the solitary pits. Back in her cell, with trembling fingers, she unfolded it. There were no words, just a crude drawing, a star with a single, elongated point, pointing down. It was Kai's symbol. Below it were two more symbols, a cracked stone and a dripping water droplet. It was a message, a location. The old, crumbling cistern in the laundry block. Midnight? The decision was no longer theoretical. It was real, tangible, and terrifying. To go was to align herself with Kai, to step into the world of blood and conspiracy she had so desperately tried to avoid. To ignore it was to accept her fate, to let the walls of Arkanum slowly squeeze the life out of her. She thought of her life before this, of the sun on her face and the feel of grass beneath her feet. Those memories were fading, replaced by the gray stone and the smell of despair. If she stayed, she would die. It might not be tomorrow or the next day, but her end was as certain as the rising of the moon. Her spirit would break long before her body gave out. That night, she slipped through the shadows, her every sense on high alert. The laundry block was eerily silent, the only sound the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water from the cistern. There, leaning against the cold stone, was Kai. He wasn't the monster of the stories. In the moonlight that filtered through a high, grimy window, he just looked like a man, tired and burdened. He didn't speak at first, just watched her with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "You came," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't trust you," Elara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. A faint smile touched his lips, a fleeting, humorless expression. "Good," he said. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford in here. But you need to trust one thing. I'm getting out of this place. The tunnel is real, but it's not a straight path to freedom. It's a maze, filled with traps set by the first prisoners to keep anyone from following them. We need a map, and I know where to find it." He explained his plan. The map was hidden in the Warden's private chambers, a place more heavily guarded than any other in Arkanum. Getting to it would be a suicide mission, but Kai had a plan, a series of diversions and deceptions that relied on a small, trusted group. He wasn't asking for her trust in him as a person. He was asking for her trust in his plan, in his singular, all-consuming desire for freedom. Elara looked at the man before her, a man whose past was a nightmare. But in his eyes, she saw the same thing she felt in her own heart, a desperate, burning will to live. It wasn't about good versus evil anymore. It was about survival. She had to make a choice. Would she cling to the crumbling ledge of her solitude, or would she take a leap of faith into the abyss with a man who might be the devil himself? The choice was simple, really. If she stayed in Arkanum, she would die. With Kai, she might die too, but at least she would die fighting, reaching for a sliver of dawn in an endless night. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The smile that touched Kai's lips this time was different. It held a flicker of something new, something that looked almost like hope. The rebellion had just found its newest member, and in the dark, suffocating heart of Arkanum, a single candle had been lit against the storm. The whispers were about to become a roar. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you next time. The rhythmic clatter of her loom was a constant hum in the background of Elara's life, a sound she had once found soothing. Now it was a countdown, each thread woven a moment closer to an unknown, grim fate. She was known as a weaver, her fingers nimble and her patterns intricate. But the true magic wasn't in the threads of wool, but in the threads of life she could mend. A secret she had guarded with her very soul. Healers were feared, hunted, seen as aberrations by Lord Malrick and his iron-fisted regime. To reveal her gift was to sign her own death warrant, or worse, be condemned to the dreaded obsidian mines, a place from which no one, not even the strongest, ever returned. The summons came at dusk, delivered by two guards whose faces were as hard and unforgiving as the stone walls of the keep. Their armor clanked with a chilling finality as they escorted her through torchlit corridors, the shadows dancing like specters on the walls. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silent dread that filled the air. She had been so careful, so discreet. Who could have betrayed her? Was it the child whose fever she had broken with a whispered word and a touch? Or the old man whose shattered leg she had mended under the cloak of a moonless night? They stopped before a set of heavy oak doors, intricately carved with snarling beasts and scenes of conquest. One of the guards pushed them open, revealing the cavernous chamber of Lord Malrick himself. The room was opulent, a stark contrast to the poverty of the villages he ruled. Rich tapestries covered the walls, depicting his own glorified victories. A fire roared in a massive hearth, casting flickering light on shelves filled with ancient tomes and peculiar artifacts. And there, seated at a large, imposing desk, was the man who haunted the nightmares of every soul in the kingdom. Lord Malrick was not a large man, but his presence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. His eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on her the moment she stepped inside. He gestured for the guards to leave, their departure leaving Elara in a silence that was somehow more terrifying than their presence. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly to stop them from trembling. "They say you're a weaver," he began, his voice a low rasp that seemed to slither across the room. "But I know what you truly are." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a stone dropping into the deep well of her fear. "You are a healer." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Elara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The end. He rose from his chair and walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He circled her like a predator sizing up its prey. "I have a proposition for you, little healer." He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the faint, unnatural heat radiating from him. "Serve me, and you will live. You will have comfort, protection, anything you desire." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Refuse." He let the word linger. "And you will join the others in the mines." And as we both know, no one survives the mines. It was then, in the suffocating proximity, that Elara noticed it. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. The way his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the chill in the room. He was trying to hide it, but her healer senses, honed by years of secret practice, saw through the facade. Lord Malrick, the invincible tyrant, was ill. Something was consuming him from the inside, a malady his own court physicians, for all their leeches and potions, could not cure. A sudden, breathtaking clarity washed over her. He wasn't just offering her a choice, he was desperate. He needed her. The fear that had paralyzed her moments before receded, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and only she knew it. She had an advantage, a small one, but it was enough. As he spoke, gesturing towards the riches of the room as if to entice her, her gaze fell upon his desk. Amidst the clutter of scrolls and daggers lay a heavy, ornate ring of keys. One of them was different, larger and more complex than the rest. The master key. The key that could unlock every cell in the dungeons below, where the other captured magic wielders, the circles, as they were called, were being held before their inevitable march to the mines. An audacious, terrifying plan bloomed in her mind. It was a gamble that could cost her everything, but the alternative was a slow death, either in his service or in the darkness of the earth. She had to try. She had to free them. Taking a deep breath, Elara sank into a low, reverent bow, a perfect picture of submission and acceptance. "My lord," she murmured, her voice steady despite the thunderous beat of her heart. "You honor me with your offer. I will serve you." As she bowed, her movement was fluid, graceful, and utterly deceptive. With a swiftness born of desperation, her hand darted out, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the master key. She palmed it, the sharp edges digging into her skin as she straightened up, her expression one of humble gratitude. He saw only what he wanted to see, a frightened girl, grateful to be spared. He didn't see the thief. He didn't see the rebel. He smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips, satisfied with his victory. "Wise choice," he said, turning his back to her and walking towards the fire. "You will begin tomorrow." Elara bowed again, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. "As you wish, my lord." She backed out of the room, her steps measured and calm, every ounce of her being focused on not betraying the secret she now held clenched in her fist. The heavy doors closed behind her, shutting out the tyrant and his gilded cage. Out in the corridor, she leaned against the cold stone, the key a burning weight in her palm. The guards led her back, not to a dungeon, but to a small, comfortable chamber near the servants' quarters, her new prison. But they didn't know it held a key. Her heart was still thundering, a chaotic symphony of fear and hope. Tonight, it had to be tonight. Before he changed his mind, before her deception was discovered. Tonight, she would not weave thread. She would weave a rebellion. Tonight, she would descend into the darkness, not as a prisoner, but as a liberator. Tonight, she would free the circles. and together they would bring the dawn. The thought sent a thrill of terror and exhilaration through her. The Weaver was done hiding. The healer was ready to fight. Thank you so much for joining me for this part of the story. I can't wait to see what happens next, and I hope you feel the same. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the thrilling conclusion. See you in the next video. Under the cloak of a moonless night, a single figure slipped through the sleeping city of Arkanum. Elara moved like a phantom, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was just a scribe, a historian, someone who dealt in dusty scrolls and forgotten tales. But tonight, she was a saboteur, a liberator. The weight of the key in her pocket felt heavier than any book she had ever carried. She descended once more into the suffocating gloom of the underground prison, the place where hope went to die. The air was thick with the stench of despair and damp stone. Guards patrolled the upper levels, their heavy boots echoing a rhythm of oppression. But down here, in the deepest cells, the forgotten were left to rot in silence. Elara found Kai's cell at the end of a long, torchlit corridor. He was exactly as she'd left him, slumped against the cold wall. His wrists and ankles bound by heavy, rune-etched iron. When she approached, his head lifted slowly. His eyes, usually sharp and defiant, were clouded with a weary resignation. But then he saw it, the glint of polished brass in her hand, the key. His eyes widened, a spark of disbelief and then a blaze of something fierce igniting within them. It was the first flicker of true hope he'd felt in years. He straightened up, the clinking of his chains a sharp sound in the quiet. "You actually came back," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "You're braver than I thought, little scribe." Elara's hand trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. "Just try not to get me killed," she retorted, her voice a low, tense whisper. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. The heavy shackle fell away from his wrist with a dull thud. Freedom. The feeling was so potent, so overwhelming. Kai had to take a moment to simply breathe it in. He flexed his fingers, feeling the blood rush back into them. He then took the key from Elara, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You've done the hard part," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Now let's start the real fun." They moved with a newfound urgency, a silent partnership forged in rebellion. Cell by cell, they worked their way down the corridor. Kai, with his knowledge of the prison layout and the other inmates, pointed out the key figures, the strategists, the warriors, the ones whose spirits hadn't been completely broken. Elara, with her steady hand and quiet determination, unlocked each restraint. With every click of the lock, a new soul was freed. Whispers turned into a low murmur of disbelief, and then a rising tide of excitement. Dozens of prisoners, men and women from every corner of the empire, emerged from their cells, their eyes blinking in the torchlight. Their expressions a mixture of awe and fierce resolve. They were a motley crew of the condemned, but in their eyes a shared fire was kindling. But their clandestine operation could not remain secret for long. A guard on a late-night sweep noticed a cell door slightly ajar. His initial confusion turned to alarm as he saw the empty shackles on the floor. He didn't even shout. He slammed his fist on the large bronze alarm rune set into the wall. A deep, gut-wrenching clang reverberated through the entire complex, a sound that signaled disaster. Instantly, the prison erupted. Bright, magical flares shot into the air, illuminating the dark corridors with a harsh, unforgiving light. The distant shouts of guards quickly grew closer, a cacophony of panicked orders and angry cries. The heavy tramp of armored boots on stone became a deafening rumble, like an approaching rockslide. The very foundations of Arkanum seemed to tremble as the city's military might was roused from its slumber. The escape was over. The rebellion had just begun. Kai grabbed a fallen guard's iron bar, his face grim but alight with a ferocious energy. "There's no going back now." He roared over the din, his voice a rallying cry for the disheveled group of former prisoners. "We either fight our way out, or we die here on our feet." A defiant cheer rose from the freed inmates. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: broken chains, loose stones, pieces of their own restraints. It was a pathetic arsenal against the trained soldiers of Arkanum, but it was wielded with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. Elara, caught in the eye of the storm she had created, felt a surge of terror, but also an exhilarating sense of purpose. She was no longer just a scribe. She was a revolutionary. Soldiers poured into the lower levels, their polished steel armor and glowing enchanted weapons a stark contrast to the prisoners' rags. The first clash was brutal. Steel met iron, shouts met screams. The narrow corridors became a chaotic bottleneck of bodies and violence. Kai was a whirlwind of motion. He fought with a raw, untamed fury of a caged animal finally unleashed. He moved with a brutal efficiency, using the cramped space to his advantage, disarming soldiers and turning their own numbers against them. The prisoners, inspired by his ferocity, fought with a desperate courage they didn't know they possessed. They formed a ragged, moving barricade around Elara, instinctively protecting the one who had given them this chance. Elara, meanwhile, found her own way to fight. She couldn't wield a sword, but she could think. Her mind raced, recalling the prison blueprints she had studied for weeks. "This way," she yelled, pointing down a little-used service tunnel. "It leads to the old aqueduct system. It's our only chance." Kai glanced at her, a look of trust in his eyes. He bellowed orders, directing the flow of the fight, pushing their small army of rebels toward the tunnel Elara had indicated. They fought for every inch, a slow, bloody retreat through the labyrinthine prison. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and blood. The sounds of battle, a relentless, deafening roar. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were fueled by a single, unifying desire: freedom. For the first time in a long time, the prisoners of Arkanum were no longer victims. They were fighters. And as they plunged into the darkness of the ancient aqueducts, they carried with them the spark of a rebellion that would soon set the entire empire ablaze. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to follow Elara and Kai's journey. Kai finally led them to the tunnel, the one whispered about in hushed, desperate tones. It wasn't just a rumor. It was real. Hidden beneath a grim monument of skeletal remains, the final resting place of prisoners who had long since succumbed to despair. The entrance was a gaping maw, a dark promise of salvation. A narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for one person, was the only path connecting their bleak reality to the dream of freedom. The air was thick with the dust of bone and the stench of decay, but to the prisoners it smelled like hope. Behind them, the terrifying clang of armor and the shouts of Malrick's soldiers grew louder, echoing through the desolate prison corridors. The sound was a death knell, a relentless pursuit that had haunted their steps since they'd broken free. Panic began to ripple through the group of ragged escapees. Their faces, already etched with years of suffering, were now masks of sheer terror. Their newfound hope was flickering, threatening to be extinguished by the approaching storm. Elara saw the fear in their eyes. She saw it threatening to paralyze them, to root them to this spot until Malrick's men arrived to drag them back to their cells, or worse. She turned to the prisoner nearest the tunnel entrance, a young man whose hands were trembling uncontrollably. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her voice a low, urgent whisper that cut through the rising chaos. "Go," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. Now, the command was simple, yet it carried the weight of their collective survival. It was the push they all needed. Hesitantly, the young man dropped to his knees and crawled into the suffocating darkness. One by one, the others followed, a desperate procession vanishing into the unknown. They moved with a frantic energy, their bodies fueled by a primal need to escape. As the last of the prisoners scrambled into the crawlspace, Elara turned back, ready to follow. But Kai hadn't moved. He stood firm, his sword drawn, a solitary guardian silhouetted against the dim torchlight. He was facing the direction of the approaching soldiers, his stance resolute. He was preparing to make a stand. The shouts were dangerously close now. They could hear individual commands, the heavy thud of armored boots on stone. Time was running out. Elara grabbed Kai's arm, her fingers digging into his worn leather bracer. Her voice was laced with a desperate plea. "Kai, what are you doing? We have to go. You can't die here." This wasn't the plan. The plan was for everyone to escape, for him to see the sun again, to feel the wind on his face. Not this. Not a pointless heroic sacrifice in the guts of a forgotten prison. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, but a deep, unyielding resolve. He gently shook his head, dislodging her grip. "I won't die here," he promised, his voice calm amidst the impending violence. "But they need a leader. They need you. Lead them, Elara. Get them to safety. I'll hold them off. I'll follow." His words were a vow, a solemn promise that seemed to hang in the dusty air between them. He was entrusting her with their lives, with the very hope he had ignited. Elara hesitated, torn between the instinct to stay and fight alongside him and the crushing responsibility he had just placed on her shoulders. The faces of the prisoners she had just sent into the tunnel flashed in her mind. They were terrified, disoriented. They needed her guidance. They wouldn't make it without a leader to push them forward. Looking one last time at Kai, she saw the certainty in his expression. He truly believed he would follow. He believed he would make it. She had to believe it too. With a final, heart-wrenching nod, she turned and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. The crawlspace was tight, claustrophobic. The smell of earth and bone was overwhelming. She could hear the shuffling and panicked breaths of the prisoners ahead of her. Behind her, the sounds of battle erupted. The sharp clang of steel on steel, the guttural cries of soldiers, and Kai's defiant roar. He was keeping his word. He was buying them time. She pushed forward, crawling on her hands and knees, urging the others on. "Keep moving. Don't stop." Her voice was hoarse, echoing in the confined space. Every inch they gained was an inch Kai had bought them with his own blood. The thought spurred her on, a painful motivator driving her through the suffocating blackness. She had to get them out. For him. Then, a deafening roar, louder than any clash of swords, shook the very ground beneath them. It wasn't the sound of battle. It was the sound of rock grinding against rock, of the earth itself groaning in protest. The tunnel trembled violently, dust and pebbles raining down from the ceiling. A wave of panicked screams erupted from the prisoners around her. Elara risked a glance back toward the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. The faint light from the prison corridor was gone. Where the entrance had been, there was now only impenetrable blackness. The roar subsided, replaced by an eerie, final silence. The entrance had collapsed. The tunnel of bones had sealed itself shut, a tomb for the living. Elara's breath hitched in her throat. She was on one side, with the promise of freedom somewhere ahead in the dark. And Kai, Kai was on the other, trapped, sealed inside with Malrick's men. His promise to follow, now just a cruel echo in a collapsed cavern. He was gone. The cold night air hit us like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the Arkanum's forge. Above us, a million stars glittered in the inky blackness, a sight we thought we'd never see again. We were a ragged, bruised, and starving group of survivors, but as we stood there, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, one word echoed in our minds: free. We were finally free, but my heart ached with a heavy, hollow feeling. I turned back, my eyes desperately searching the dark silhouette of the cliff face where we'd made our escape. There was no sign of Kai, no flicker of light from his luminous stones, no movement, no call, just the silent, unforgiving rock. A sob caught in my throat. Tears welled up, blurring the beautiful stars into a watery mess. "He saved us," I whispered, the words barely audible over the rustling leaves. He had sacrificed himself so that we could live. The weight of his final act settled upon my shoulders, a burden and a blessing all at once. The days that followed were a blur of survival. We found shelter in a nearby village, one that had suffered its own losses at the hands of the Arkanum. Their homes were charred husks, their fields scorched, but their spirit, like ours, refused to be extinguished. We joined them, our shared grief and determination forging a new, fragile community. I threw myself into the work of rebuilding, hauling timber, mixing clay, and raising walls. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, a way to numb the constant, gnawing pain of Kai's absence. Every crackle of the fire, every shadow that danced at the edge of my vision made me think of him. A week passed like this, a week of sweat, sorrow, and slow, painful healing. We were beginning to piece our lives back together, one broken board at a time. The air was filled with the sounds of hammers and saws, the scent of fresh-cut wood, and the cautious laughter of children who were learning to play again. Hope was a tiny, flickering flame, but it was there. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the half-built structures, I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, cloaked and hooded, almost blending into the deepening twilight. My heart leaped into my throat, a frantic, panicked beat. Was it a scout from the Arkanum? Had they found us? I reached for the axe I kept by my side, my knuckles white. The figure took a slow step forward, out of the shadows and into the dimming light. My breath hitched. There was something unnervingly familiar about the way he stood, the set of his shoulders. Then, a voice low and rough, but a voice that I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, murmured across the clearing. "Didn't I tell you I'd follow?" Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the village faded into a distant hum. My axe slipped from my grasp, thudding softly onto the dirt. It couldn't be. It was impossible. I had seen the cavern collapse. I had felt the ground shake. I took a hesitant step, then another, my legs feeling like they were moving through water. As I drew closer, he lowered his hood. My world tilted on its axis. It was Kai. He was alive. The same intense, piercing eyes I remembered found mine. But something was different. The smooth porcelain mask that had always hidden his face was gone. In its place, a jagged, angry scar ran from the corner of his eye, down across his jaw, a permanent reminder of the hell he had endured. A gasp escaped my lips. I wanted to run to him, to throw my arms around him, to make sure he was real, and not just another cruel trick of my grieving mind. But I was frozen, caught between disbelief and overwhelming relief. He gave me a small, tired smile, a ghost of the smirk I knew so well. It didn't quite reach his eyes. The joy of seeing him was immediately tempered by the grim reality of what his survival meant. He wouldn't have come back just for a reunion. "The Arkanum isn't finished," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual sarcastic edge. The words landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. My brief moment of pure, unadulterated happiness evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. "They're rebuilding," he continued, his gaze shifting towards the distant mountains where their fortress once stood. "They're gathering their forces, recruiting from the desperate and the broken. The fall of the forge was just a setback for them, not a defeat." He looked back at me, the weariness in his expression making him seem years older. "We have to stop them, Elara. For good this time." He wasn't asking. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of a war that had never truly ended. I looked at him, really looked at him, the new scar, the haunted look in his eyes, the set of his jaw. He was no longer the mysterious, cocky rogue who had stumbled into my life. He was a warrior, forged in fire and loss, just like me. I thought of the survivors around us, of the children just learning to laugh again, of the fragile peace we had started to build. It was all a lie if the Arkanum still existed. Their shadow would always hang over us, a promise of more pain, more loss. I looked from Kai's determined face to the small, hopeful village behind me, and my own resolve hardened like steel. The fight hadn't ended in that cavern. Our escape wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the first chapter. I met his gaze, and with a slow, deliberate nod, I gave him my answer. Our fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Together, we would face whatever came next, and this time we would be the fire that burned the Arkanum to ashes. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the world of the Arkanum. This finale is just the beginning of a whole new adventure for Elara and Kai. If you loved this story and want to see what happens next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so much more planned, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think will happen next. Your support means the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.